Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Strange Minds 6. I'm your host, Ruby, and today we're going to be getting back into Beware the Claws That Catch Alice by Christina Henry. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It'd mean a great deal to me. And as always, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax. And let's get to it. Beware the Claws That Catch Alice by Christina Henry. Chapter 7. Alice sucked in her breath, astonished. You mean Cheshire's a magician? How can that be? Why wasn't he driven away with all the other magicians? It seemed incredible that such a blatant display of magic would go unnoticed by the city officials. No, he's not a magician, Hatcher said, but his house was built by one, and Cheshire moved in when the magician left. How has he managed to keep it? Alice asked. Given the fighting she'd already seen over money, territory, and girls, how was it that Cheshire's house hadn't been snatched up by the local boss? Hatcher gave her a slightly sneaky sideways look, as if he knew she was not going to be pleased. Cheshire's the head of this area. He's a boss? Alice asked. You're taking me into the house of one of those people? No, Hatcher said hastily. Cheshire doesn't deal in girls. He'll have no interest in you, leastway, not like that. He deals in information, so be careful what you say to him, or around him. No matter how he seems, Cheshire is not your friend. He'll sell you out in an instant if he thinks it will benefit him. Hatch, that does not comfort me in the least, Alice said. Just talk as little as you can, Hatcher said, walking to the edge of the roof and peering down. And it may be a good idea for you to keep being Alex. Right, Alice said. She'd half forgotten the clothes she wore were meant to be a disguise. Nell had seen through the fiction so easily that Alice hadn't practiced being a boy in actual company yet. There's a balcony just below here, Hatcher said, indicating with his hand. Don't people live there? Alice asked in a whisper. Likely, Hatcher said, but we will only be there for a moment, and then we'll be on the ground. What if someone sees us and starts screaming? We need to get to Cheshire's house. We can't land on his roof from here. Well, come to think of it, we can't land on his roof at all. Why not? I told you. Those roses have magic, Hatcher said. They keep intruders away. And how did they do that? Alice asked. The roses appeared less beautiful to her now, the gleaming petals less obvious than the pointed thorns and malicious vines. Just don't get too close to the flowers until Cheshire has approved you, Hatcher said. I'll swing you down here. As soon as your boots touch the landing, you climb over the side and drop to the street. I can't go down there until you move. There's not enough room. Hurry it up, Alice. The sun's coming up, and folk will be about their business soon. We'll be seen. Hatcher grabbed Alice under the shoulders and swung her over the edge of the roof before she had a chance to look at the situation over properly. She had a terrible moment of fear that the landing was not below her, that Hatcher would release her and her feet would kick wildly in the air and find no purchase. But then his hands slid away from her, and the balcony was there a second later, just as he said it would be, and she made less noise than expected. Washing hung out to dry on a line. A woman's underthings and a couple of men's shirts. There was a grimy window and a wooden door that wouldn't have kept out a curious cat. Inside, the occupants stirred, the slow shuffle of morning feet on bare floor. Alice swung her leg over the side and made a concerted effort not to think about what she was doing. Going up on the roof had seemed like such a smart idea when it was dark, and she couldn't really see how high she was. She glanced down just long enough to make sure she wasn't about to land in a coal cart or on top of someone's head. The ground looked very far away. "Alice!" Hatcher hissed. She closed her eyes and pushed away from the side and hoped she would not break her legs or her nose. Somehow, a miracle occurred and the ground did not take a bite out of her. A moment later, she stood in the street in front of Cheshire's house, on her own 2 feet and nothing broken. There was a faint warmth at her chest, and she lifted the shirt a little to see the rose pendant that Bess gave her glowing with a faint light, though it faded so quickly that she wondered whether she'd imagined it. Then Hatcher was at her side, light-footed and sure. She rearranged her clothing so the pendant was well hidden, and followed him to Cheshire's doorstep. The rose's perfume was stifling at this distance. It permeated the air around them, pushed away the usual stink of sweat and food and offal that hung in the air. But it wasn't necessarily a better smell, Alice thought. There was something not right about that sweet twinning scent, something that snuck up in between her eyes and made her head ache. The cottage, for that is what it really was, covered so completely in roses that not a silver of the outside wall was revealed, only the door, painted white like a gleaming tooth, and a scrupulously clean 4-paned window escaped the pervasive touch of the flowers. Hatcher knocked 3 times on the door, his hand dark and filthy against the shimmering white paint. Only after Hatcher knocked did something occur to Alice. "Perhaps it's a little too early to come calling," she asked. "The sun has barely risen. Won't Cheshire be angry at being woken?" Hatcher shook his head, not chagrined in the least. "He won't be angry if he thinks we've brought him something interesting." "What do we have that's interesting?" Alice asked, but she never found out the answer. The door opened, then, smooth and silent in oiled hinges. A very large man stood there, about as tall as Hatcher, but much better fed. He was dressed in unrelieved black and held a short coil of silver wire in one hand. There was a tattoo of a smiling cat on the back of the hand, between the last knuckle of his thumb and the thick bone of his wrist. His eyes were as black as his clothes, and they took in Alice and Hatcher's ragged appearance in one glance. "Get off with you," he said, and started closing the door. Hatcher reached to stall him, his hand stopping the door halfway. The man looked from Hatcher's hand to his face, those black eyes calm and endless and unyielding. Hatcher returned the gaze with the same calm, though Alice fought the impulse to tug at Hatcher's arm and pull him away. "We're here to see Cheshire. Tell him Bess sent us," Hatcher said. "Mr. Hatcher don't have time for the likes of you," the man said. "Now I'm telling you for the last time, get off and stay off. Cheshire will be very unhappy if you don't tell him we're here," Hatcher said. "And if I remember right, it's not a pretty sight when Cheshire isn't happy." Fear flared in those black depths, a flash so quick that Alice thought she imagined it. The guard's expression never changed. He and Hatcher continued to stare at each other for a long moment. "Wait here," the guard said, and shut the door. "Hatch, what is it that we have that Cheshire will find interesting?" she asked again. "Us, of course," Hatcher said. "But I thought you said not to say anything in front of him," Alice said. "I said to watch what you say," Hatcher said. "Cheshire likes information, and you don't want to have any information that you don't want him to have. And you don't want him to have any information that you don't want him to have. Yeah." Alice shook her head, not sure whether the conversation was actually going in circles or whether the roses were making her feel like it was. But he likes new things and new people, and he likes Bess, or he did. He helped her once, Hatcher said. "Are you remembering more?" Alice asked. Hatcher seemed a wealth of information all of a sudden. He tilted his head to the side, thinking, "No, just what I need to remember. There are still black spots where other things were." Alice wondered about the black spots in her own memory, and whether Cheshire could tell her if the rabbit was dead. If he was a fountain of information, then he was sure to know. But Bess had told her to stay away from the rabbit and anything to do with him, and Hatcher said not to tell Cheshire anything. If Cheshire did know about the rabbit's fate, then he would wonder why Alice wanted to know, and that might lead to other questions. No, it was better not to bring the rabbit up at all. Behind them on the street, people were going about the business of their day. Alice heard a noise above them and glanced behind and up. A careworn woman of indeterminate age was removing the washing from the landing that Alice and Hatcher had used to climb down from the roof. The door swung open again and the guard stood there. Alice thought he appeared sourer than before, as if he'd eaten something that didn't taste very pleasant. "Mr. Cheshire will see you now," he said, his grip tightening on the silver wire he held, as if he were itching to use it. They were led through a very tiny foyer, with a marbled floor, into a small parlor, with the most exquisitely carved furniture Alice had ever seen. All of it white and spotless like the front door. A beautiful little round table with elegant curved legs sat in the middle of the room, 4 matching chairs around it, The chairs had plump embroidery cushions on the seat, and the backs were carved. All around the walls were smaller tables and fat cushioned ottomans, and everywhere there were roses. Roses in vases on the table, and roses painted in pictures and hung in frames. Roses were sewn into the chair cushions and multiplied in patterns on the wall. The same heavy scent that hung outside the house was even more pronounced here, despite the presence of fewer flowers. The windows were shut, keeping the perfume contained in the small space. On the table were several cakes shaped like roses, and small sugar candies carved in the same likeness. There was a pot of tea, steam curling from the spout, and 3 cups set out for pouring. Alice wondered, for all of this, Alice wondered that all of this was put together so quickly while they stood at the door and waited. It was almost as if Cheshire had known they were coming. But that couldn't be. They'd discussed their plans with no one but Bess. In the midst of all this petaled splendor was a man, standing near the center table and grinning an oversized grin. Everything about the man was unexpected. The huge guard had appeared, scared of Cheshire's anger. Alice thought a man who wielded so much power and frightens such a large man would be large himself. That he would appear a strong man, not to be crossed, but Cheshire was nothing like that. He was as small and neat as the parlor he stood in. His head would come to just above Alice's elbow if he was close by her. That head was covered all over with golden brown hair, carefully curled in ringlets. His eyes were bright and green and curious. He wore a velvet suit of rose red. It seemed so soft that Alice longed to stroke it with her fingers. Cheshire's grin widened as he looked them over, a glint of recognition in his eyes when he saw Hatcher. Alice decided she didn't like that grin. It wasn't happy. It was more like a predatory animal baring his teeth. Cheshire waved at the guard. "Thank you, Theodore." Alice glanced behind her as the guard left. He did not appear pleased at being sent from the room. Well, well, Bess Carby's grandson. What are you doing out of your cage, little bird? I heard a long while ago that you did very bad things, and they sent you away where all the mad little birds are kept. Hatcher started in surprise. How did you know that? Bess didn't even know where I'd been. Oh, I know many things, Cheshire said, pulling out a chair and seating himself. Please join me. It was not a request. It was spoken in the same cheery tone as everything else, but Alice heard the steel underneath it. She and Hatcher maneuvered into the little chairs, both of them so tall that their knees knocked against the table. Cheshire poured out tea, his eyes roving over them all the while. Yes, I know about Nicholas, but I don't know you, my lad. And quite big and dangerous looking you are with that scar. That scar, Alice didn't like the thoughtful look on his face. In fact, she was quickly realizing that she did not like anything about Cheshire at all. Not his rose-covered house, or the heavy perfume of roses that made her feel sick. Not his knowing smile, or the spectacular way he looked at her scar. She didn't want to have tea with this man. She wanted to find out what they needed to know and then leave. "This is Alex," Hatcher said before Alice could speak. "Alex?" Cheshire said, rolling the name around in his mouth, like he was tasting it. Then he shook his head. "No, that is not your name." The grin was gone now. The merry eyes were flat as a snake's. "It is not polite to tell lies, especially when you are my guest. I do not care for lies." He had not threatened them, and the idea of this little man physically overpowering them both was absurd. Yet Alice felt a distinct chill in the air, a threat of menace that had not been there before. This man was dangerous, more dangerous than she thought. She took the cap from her head, thinking quickly. "It's not Alex, it's Alice. And I hope you'll forgive us for the deception, sir. It's only for my own safety." Hatcher gave her a quick, annoyed look, as if to say, "Why pretend to be a boy if everyone you meet knows you're a girl?" And Alice didn't disagree. But it seemed far more dangerous to lie to Cheshire. The hard glint in Cheshire's eyes softened a bit as he considered it. "Alice, is it? Alice. And that scar." He drifted off, his eyes dreamy now, as if he sifted through the vast stores of knowledge in his head. Then he suddenly snapped his fingers and sat up straighter. That horrible grin returned. "Alice! Yes, of course. Another naughty little bird. You ran away, Alice. Yes, you did. And you made the rabbit so distressed, and he couldn't find you." Her body went stiff with fear. Cheshire knew who she was. It didn't sound as though the rabbit was dead. It sounded as though he was alive, and this man knew who she was, and who she was to the rabbit. If Cheshire wanted, he could have his guard put her in a gunny sack and carry her straight to the rabbit again. "But he marked you, didn't he?" he continued. At these words, Cheshire reached across the tiny table, the first two fingers of his hand extended. Alice knew what would happen and steeled herself not to show any emotion. Cheshire's fingers, cold and slightly damp, stroked down the scar of her cheek. She swallowed and shuddered of revulsion at his touch. "Yes," Cheshire said. "He marked you so that he would know you again, and know that you belong to him." "I belong to no one," Alice said, her voice harsher than she intended. She would fight if she must, and so would Hatcher. Whatever power Cheshire wielded, he would and could not make her go back to the rabbit. Cheshire giggled. "Oh yes, there's that spirit that the rabbit liked before you spirited away, that is." "Then he was not so fond of your energy, particularly after what you did to him." A blade in a blue green eye. Cheshire watched her carefully, and Alice feared he could read the thought that had gone across her face. She must be careful now, very careful. Yes, Cheshire said, taking a bite of rose-shaped cake. I think the rabbit would be very interested to know you're in the old city. Alice didn't know what to do. Should she threaten Cheshire? Should she tell Hatch to pay him so that he wouldn't talk? He seemed the sort of person who might like knowing something another didn't. He might like lording it over them in his own mind. Then suddenly she knew what to do. The rabbit and me is hardly news, is it? Alice said lightly. A very old affair. But one thing I assure you, that the rabbit thinks of every day. You made quite sure of that, my dear, Cheshire said. Yes, if I did take his eye, I imagine he would think of me every day, Alice thought. She splunged on, aware that Hatcher watched the proceedings with a curious gaze. They were doing a precise opposite of what they'd intended, that Hatcher should talk and Alice should listen, but Hatcher was wise enough not to muddy the waters and to wait until Alice was finished. I think the more interesting news is the return of the Jabberwocky. Do you not agree? Alice asked. It hadn't seemed possible, but Cheshire sat up even straighter then. Alice thought he was surprised, but she couldn't tell for certain. Cheshire was very difficult to read. And what does the rabbit's lost toy know about the Jabberwocky? Cheshire asked. Something in her heart burned. When he called her a lost toy, she did not show it. We have seen him, Alice said, indicating Hatcher and herself. Seen him and survived? Cheshire asked, and now it was clear that he was surprised. How can that be? Good fortune, Alice said. She did not want Cheshire to know about the pendant or how Nell claimed she sent the Jabberwocky away. Good fortune indeed, Cheshire said, and he narrowed his eyes and looked between the two of them. Of a kind not usually found in his presence. Is it because of the Jabberwocky that we are here? It is because of the Jabberwocky that we are here, Alice said. Bess told us that you could tell us how to trap him again. The little man chortled. Trap the Jabberwock? You are ambitious, aren't you, little toy? Alice said nothing. He was baiting her, hoping she would lose her temper and reveal something she did not want him to know. Bess said the Jabberwock was searching for something, Hatcher said. Alice noted that Hatcher did not mention his own connection to the monster, and that you would know what that something was. Oh yes, he searches, Cheshire said. Snicker snack, snicker snack. He must have it before anyone else does, before anyone realizes what it does. What is it? Alice asked, unable to hide her impatience. Cheshire sat forward, his eyes eager. Would you like to hear a story, my little ones? For I have a story I could tell. I like to tell my stories sometimes. Alice thought he would like such a thing. It would be a way for him to show off what he knew, but only as much as he wanted to tell. He looked at them expectantly, waiting for them to acknowledge the treat. I would like very much to hear a story, Alice said, and tried to sound properly grateful, instead of resentful, which was what she was actually feeling when she said it. A long time ago, Cheshire said, his voice dreamy again, there was a magician. Well, to tell it properly, there were two magicians, and these two were friends, close as brothers. Both had an insatiable hunger for knowledge, to find the furthest reaches of their power, to discover how deep magic could take them. But one line they swore never to cross was that, and that was into dark magic, for they knew that once tasted, the darkness would overcome even the purest of intent. And so they went on, day after day, experimenting and growing ever more powerful, until no other magician could possibly defeat them. They were the strongest, most magnificent magicians in the world, and for one of them it was enough. He used his magic to help the common folk, to make their crops grow, to heal their sick, to do good with the gifts he had been given. But the other, well, there are some who will never be content. He grew restless and saw the giving of magic to simple folk as unworthy of his power, and so in secret, he went to the dark places and learned all the dark things there were to know. As Alice listened to Cheshire's dreamy remembering voice, she heard another, laid over the voice of the man. It was light and soft and full of love, and it sounded like her mother. She could see her mother's face there, just above her in the flickering candlelight, as she snuggled under the coverlet. His friend, once so close as a brother, saw the changes in him and protested, tried to stop him, but the other had drunk deep in the well of shadows, and for him there was no returning. The good magician knew then what he must do, for such a threat could not be allowed to exist in the world. He went to the blacksmith and asked him to make a blade, a special blade that curved like the moon at its crescent. Before the last strike of the blacksmith's hammer, the good magician took the blade in his palm and closed it around his hand. His blood seeped into the blade, and so did a little of his magic and his intent. Then the blacksmith struck the blade once more and declared his work complete. The good magician took the weapon with a heavy heart, for he mourned the friend and brother he once had. He went to the place where the other magician was learning the ways of darkness. His friend had become a monster, hideous and twisted, and the good magician was repulsed by this creature. The monster that had once been a magician laughed as his old friend stood before him and said nothing could defeat him. But the good magician had right on his side, and his pure heart, and though the two battled for many days, in the end the good magician prevailed. He pinned the monster to the ground with his blade, and the blade drew away some of the monster's magic, so that he could no longer defend himself. The monster told the magician to kill him, for if not he would rise up again and destroy the magician and all of his line. But the magician could not kill his friend, though he knew it was necessary. In the end, he took the monster and put him in a box, a tiny prison, without a key, and buried the box deep in the soil. Then he went away from that place, taking the blade with him. Her voice faded away, and it was only then that Alice realized she spoke in time with Cheshire, and that he and Hatcher both stared at her. You know the story of how the Jabberwock was formed, then? Cheshire asked, and his eyes were more speculative than before. Alice began, and then thought it wise not to mention her mother. Someone told me once when I was young, but I'd forgotten it until you told it again today. It is very interesting that you know that tale, Cheshire said. Yes, you are very interesting, Alice. I can see why the rabbit prized you so. Each time Cheshire mentioned the rabbit so casually, she felt like ice was pricking her all over her skin. Memories surfaced one by one, and she was afraid to see all of them at once, and afraid that if Cheshire continued to mention it, all of her lost thoughts would return in a rush and destroy her. So the Jabberwock was a magician, and another magician took some of his power in the blade that defeated him. Hatcher said. Alice knew he tried to stir Cheshire away from the topic of the rabbit, and she was grateful. Snicker snack, Cheshire said again. The Jabberwock seeks that blade, for he is crippled without the magic inside it. He cannot become full until that power is returned to him, and the blade is also the only way to defeat him, for the good magician put his power inside it also. Then we simply need to find it. Alice said, and the Jabberwocky, oh, don't fret, my dear. I'm certain he will find you. You are very interesting, Cheshire said again. Alice did not wish to be interesting to Cheshire or to the Jabberwock. It was true that the Jabberwock would be drawn to them, but that was because of Hatcher's connection to the creature, not because of her. In Alice's mind, therefore, the wisest thing would be to find the sword as soon as possible, before the creature drew near them again. Do you know where the blade is? Hatcher asked. His feet moved restlessly under the table. Hatcher never liked to be still for so long. Even in the hospital, he was constantly moving, pacing, twitching, rolling. The uncomfortable chairs and low table essentially pinned him in a place, and Alice sensed he was on the verge of having enough. I know many things, Nicholas, grandson of Bess Carby. I know things you yourself do not know. I know where Jenny is, far away, over the forest and over the mountains. She's gone. Cheshire sat back a little, apparently to appreciate the effects of his news. But these words apparently meant nothing to Hatcher, who only frowned slightly. "Do you know where the sword is?" he repeated. Cheshire looked put out, as though he were expecting to enjoy an explosion that didn't occur. "I don't know where the blade is now," Cheshire said, his tone short. Alice and Hatcher looked at each other, their feelings plain. This trip was a waste. However, Cheshire said, and the crafty tone was back in his voice, "I know someone who may know." "And who is that?" Alice asked, though she did not relish the thought of another goose chase across the old city, only to find someone who may or may not have what they are looking for. "I shall tell you." Cheshire said. "First, you must give me something in return." Alice wanted to say he had already gotten plenty, more than they had intended to give, but she did not want to remind him of the rabbit again. It was too much to hope that he would forget who she was, but perhaps the Jabberwock would distract him. "What is it that you want?" Alice asked. "Why, your memory, of course," Cheshire said. "Your memory of taking the rabbit's eye." And that is the end of chapter 7. Tune in next video, my dear friends, for it is getting interesting. This has been Ruby, signing off.